Hello, my name is Philip Cook and I'd like to say a few words about my chapter, What's Wrong with Child Labour. So the main goal of this chapter is to identify the main moral objections to child labour. I want to distinguish a series of different objections that are often conflated and mixed up with each other to show that they are in fact quite different. And I then want to look at them in some detail and to show that they are in fact more limited and perhaps more problematic than one might assume at first sight. So what are these three different objections that I identify? Well, the first is those kinds of objections that are concerned with the harm that child labour might do to children. So it's certainly the case that some forms of child labour are very harmful to children, those that are dangerous, those that involve some kind of hazard, whether physical or even moral hazard to children. These worst forms of child labour are clearly harmful and they should definitely be abolished. It's clear that there's moral objections to them. But there is a whole range of other kinds of work that children do where I think it's less clear that there is harm involved. And why is it less clear that there's harm involved? Well, the main point I want to make is that harm normally involves us establishing that doing work, in this case, is more harmful than doing something else, what's called the comparative counterfactual view of harm. But what are we comparing child labour against? What are the baselines of comparison in establishing that something is harmful, child labour in this case? And I want to show that there are lots of problems and lots of difficulties in establishing the baselines of comparison to allow us to make a clear judgment that child labour is harmful. So part of the paper is concerned with the problems about establishing the child labour or the limitations of establishing that child labour is harmful. But there are a series of other objections that are often muddled up with objections based on the concern that child labour is harmful. And those are to do with the objection that child labour prevents children from receiving some other benefit. So the idea is that if children are busy working, even though it might not be very harmful to them, it prevents them from doing something else that is more beneficial, such as going to school. And lots of campaigns argue that we should stop child labour and that children should go to school. And so it seems to me those kinds of objections are not necessarily to do with the harm of child labour, but they are to do with children being given a chance to receive a greater benefit, namely that of an education, of going to school. So I think first of all it's important to distinguish these kinds of objections, which I don't think is done perhaps as clearly as it could have been done in the past in the philosophical and in the political campaigning literature. But there are also problems with these ideas of failing to provide a benefit. So are we certain that going to school would necessarily be more beneficial to children than working? It's not always the case. There's lots of interesting economic and development literature that shows that going to school can in fact be less beneficial to children than working. So I want to look at this argument in some detail and to show that, yes, it might apply in some cases, but probably in a more limited range of cases than we might think at first sight. But if we are able to distinguish objections to child labour based on harm, objections to child labour based on failing to provide a benefit, we must also recognise that there are times when child labour may be wrongful, but may neither be harmful nor may be preventing them from enjoying a benefit, which is to say that there may be occasions under which child labour is wrong because it's exploitative. So I'm concerned to identify arguments for the wrongness of child labour because it's exploitative from arguments against child labour because it is harmful or it fails to provide a benefit. So I say a little bit about what exploitative labour might involve and give examples of where it's clear that children are experiencing exploitative child labour. But then I also point to cases where children have themselves organised and campaigned for better working conditions against the exploitation that they experience in their working conditions, but where they want to continue working. They want good work, not exploitative work. It's not that they want no work. That good work is the best option available to them. It's better than no work and it's better than going to school. So I think we should take seriously that if the wrong we're concerned with is exploitative child labour, and if we can identify conditions under which child labour might not be exploitative, and it might not be harmful, and it might not be failing to provide some other benefit to them, then in fact child labour could be justified. So the end of the paper really leaves us with, I think, a really interesting and perhaps surprising conclusion that once we've clearly established different types of objections to child labour, and once we've seen that they are in some ways quite limited, then that opens up scope for us to establish that there may be conditions under which child labour is justified and could perhaps be good for children. So I think that's the next stage of research that would be interesting to do in this area, to think about when work might be good and might be justified for children. But I hope by the end of this paper to at least shown that it's very important for us to have greater clarity and a greater understanding of the different types of objections to child labour. Hope to have made some progress in that respect, and then opened up this possibility that there may be new ways of thinking about child labour that may point to the positive and in fact the benefits that it could provide to children. So I hope you have a chance to have a look at the paper and enjoy the collection as a whole. Thanks very much.